Farewell, happy fields where joy forever dwells. Hail, horrors, hail, infernal world, and thou, profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice, to reign is worth ambition though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven.
Ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho-ho.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we will be talking about John Milton's Paradise Lost. It's a very lovely spring day. Finally, the winter seems to be ending, and this seems like a much darker poem than fits the mood of spring weather.
I know, it's super dark. Like, I really have two minds because on the one hand, I really love Milton. I think it's beautiful poetry in ways that we're going to talk about later, but it's hard to talk about, and it's troublesome, and it's dark in all kinds of ways.
I have to admit, although I also quite love a lot of this poem, I've never read it beginning to end, and I wasn't able to for this recording because it's been crazy. But nevertheless, every time I pick it up and read a bit of it, I'm just enraptured by his language and where his mind will unexpectedly take you.
Yeah, he has a very strong mind. And in some ways that's troublesome. I remember being kind of disturbed and troubled by Milton at different times that I've read this poem and all the other things by him as well. But again, it's beautiful.
It's not always a mind that you agree with.
Oh, no. Like almost never, right?
Yeah, almost never.
One of the things that's striking about Paradise Lost is it's a lot like the very first work we talked about together, the Iliad, where there's no surprises. We know what the plot is. There's no surprises in terms of where we're going to end up, but there are a ton of surprises on the way there. And also it's, again, I think very similar to the experience of reading the Iliad in that you can just pull little bits and pieces out. I mean, it's interesting to read beginning to end, but there's no obligation to do that. You could almost start anywhere because you get oriented as to what's going on by the argument, the little prose summary that appears at the beginning of each of the books. So you know what's happening. And then if you just read a little section, you get a sense of the language without necessarily having to commit yourself to what's going on in the whole plot.
No, although it isn't quite as easy to do that as it is perhaps with the Iliad, because it can be very tricky when looking at this long text to figure out who is speaking now, what are they responding to, where is the verb sometimes.
No, it's very strange poetry, right? Because in some ways it's deceptively simple. Like, it uses a lot of monosyllables. Like, the language is often very simple, but the syntax will be convoluted. It'll be something like what you would find in a Latin or Greek text, right? And it's not convoluted because he's a clumsy poet. It's exactly the opposite. It's convoluted because he can do that, and he's doing it for a reason. He's always doing it for a reason.
So a good example of one of his monosyllables, and one that I saw brought up when I was learning poetic techniques, is from Book 2. So we have a description of the fallen angels going across the underworld that they've been exiled to, and it goes rocks, caves, lakes, fens, bogs, dens, and shades of death.
Beautiful.
So pounding, so insistent upon the nature of this underworld place, and told through these very strong monosyllabic words. Well, let's start digging into the text. Why don't you start by giving us a brief summary of who Milton was and when he was and why he was.
Yeah. So he's an interesting character. I think he seems incredibly unlikable. He seems like somebody who was very sure that he was always right about everything. And I think that has to be a real challenge to live with. So he lived in the 1600s from 1608 to 74. And his father was a composer. That wasn't his main line of work, but it's an interesting fact because music is something that's really important to Milton. It shows up a lot in his poetry, including in Paradise Lost. He clearly thinks about it a lot and understands it as a kind of counterpoint to everything, every kind of knowledge in the world. Like his poetry is very musical. And so I think that background is important. So he's educated at a Latin grammar school, and then he goes to Cambridge. And he's clearly a brilliant scholar. A number of his writings from that time survive. But he also, it's hard to know what kind of life he had when he was at university. His nickname was the Lady. The Lady of Christ College. You gotta wonder. You gotta wonder. There people have speculated about exactly what was going on there. Anyway, so after he finished college, he basically stayed at home on his father's dime and just kept reading, which is what made him the incredibly learned person he was. But also, again, what kind of person does that? And then he went to France and Italy and became a schoolmaster. And he got married to the first of his 3 wives. He was 35, she was 16, and after a month, she left and went home to her parents. Make of that what you will. And during the time she's away, and it's hard to know whether she's away for whatever it is, like 4 years or something, because she doesn't want to come back or because there's warfare in the country, right? It's hard to know what the reason is. But clearly they're estranged because it's during that period that he writes a bunch of tracts about how divorce should be allowed. Including one really powerful one called The Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce. And this is when he becomes very politically engaged. Like, he's already a poet, right? He already has a strong sense of himself as a poet, a kind of self-invention as a poet. But then he's also going to be politically really radical. And those tracts are part of it. And during that period, too, he writes this one prose tract called Areopagitica. It's about printing and the freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And I think that is an interesting thing to talk about. Anyway, she finally comes back in 1645, has 4 kids, and dies in childbirth. And this will be kind of a pattern for Milton's wives. He gets married again in 1656. That second wife also dies in childbirth. And a few years before that, Milton's had other hardship, too. He's gone completely blind. And that really inflects both the nature of his poetic production. He has to dictate his poetry. He has to make it up and then dictate it in the mornings to his daughters. He describes that as being milked, like a cow is milked. Yeah, it's kind of icky. And anyway, that second wife dies too. And then he marries a third wife later on who sort of takes care of him into his old age. And the way in which he treated those daughters who basically had to look after his needs and serve him contrasts, interestingly, with the way he treated his nephews, the Phillips brothers, who he tutored and mentored, both of whom became writers. One of them was Milton's first biographer. Milton clearly had a real sense of what was appropriate.
Now, did any of his daughters end up being writers?
No. Well, not that we know of.
Mm.
Yeah, interesting. Anyway, so he's very politically engaged. And as I said, poet, pamphleteer, schoolmaster, and also Latin secretary. He was very involved in the Commonwealth political government that was between the 2 kings, Charles I and Charles II. So he's somebody who's very much involved in the revolutionary activities of his age, but also an intensely solitary figure. Like, sometimes people who are involved in politics are consensus builders. They lead a party. They bring people together. They're community builders. Milton is the opposite of that. Somebody who seems to be very happy to be right, even if he's right all by himself. I know, it all sounds just off right, but I swear the poetry is really good. I mean, there's a limit to how much we can know about the personal life of somebody who lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But I think especially when we read their writing, and especially when we get kind of emotionally involved in their writing, it's hard not to imaginatively engage with them, like to imagine closing up that gap between knowing their writing and knowing them. Especially if you read a book over a long period of time and you've read it as a young person, you've read it as a middle of life person, and you've read it later. It's hard not to feel as though in some sense you know them too, which of course you don't. It's an illusion. But those feelings are real. Even though the connection isn't real, the feelings are real. And that's neat to think about.
Do we have a sense of why he decided to write Paradise Lost?
Well, he was interested in writing an epic from very early on. In his notebooks, he talks soon after he'd finished at university of writing an epic poem. And at that time, he wanted to write the epic poem about the matter of Britain. It was going to be about King Arthur and all that. And then finally, he gets to the point of writing an epic poem in the 1660s. Paradise Lost comes out in 1667. And by that time, he still wants to write an epic, but he's going to write it instead using the matter of the Bible itself. So much more ambitious, right? Understanding himself not just as a poet in the mode of like Virgil in the Aeneid, for example, or Homer with the Iliad, writing about a nation, but rather like as if he was writing scripture itself. And in that sense, he's a little bit like Dante, who we talked about last time, using the matter of the Bible kind of as your subject.
Now, there had been a long tradition of epic poems that were paraphrases or reworkings of biblical material in the Middle Ages in particular. I know that there were several.
Yeah. Was
he drawing upon that tradition, or I mean, this does feel quite different from a lot of that work.
Well, there is some common ground. In particular, there's this one Old English, one of the Genesis poems that has some resemblance to some of the scenes that we see in Paradise Lost. And we know that Milton was involved with a circle of people who were really interested in Old English poetry and trying to make sense of Anglo-Saxon culture in the 1600s. So that connection is real. But as you were suggesting, the flavor of Paradise Lost is very much in keeping with Greek and Latin epic. It's like reading the Iliad. It's like reading the Aeneid. It's like reading that kind of stuff of antiquity, that pre-Christian epic, even though the content is very much in keeping with, like you said, the medieval biblical epics, or like Dante.
Well, let's go over the short plot, so to speak,
of
Paradise Lost.
There's not a lot of plot.
There's not a lot. It's basically the story of 2 sets of characters who lose access to two different paradises. So first we have Satan and the rebel angels who fought against God and lost and were cast out of heaven and sent down to hell to rule there. And second, we have Adam and Eve, the first humans who are tempted by Satan, submit to temptation, and are, at the end, exiled from the Garden of Eden. Now, I think Milton is consistent in referring to the Garden of Eden as paradise in the text, but obviously both of them are kinds of paradises. So the text opens in hell as Satan and the other fallen angels land, and they have to pick themselves up again and decide whether they're going to resume the war that they just got trounced in. And they argue about this back and forth, but they decide instead to go after God's new creation, the humans. And so Satan manages to get out of hell, goes to earth, meets Adam and Eve, and starts to tempt them. But Satan gets kicked out of Eden by an angel, and God sends Raphael, another angel, to talk with Adam and Eve and to help them deal with temptation. And they have a very long flashback-filled conversation. That's basically
like 4 books full of flashback conversation.
It's a third of the entire book. Satan gets back into Eden after that conversation, disguised as a serpent, and gets Eve to eat the fruit of the tree that God has forbidden them to eat, which he then gets Adam to eat from as well, or Adam decides to, perhaps. And Satan returns to hell, his minions turned into snakes. Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, but another angel, Michael, tells him in great detail about what's going to happen into the future, including their eventual redemption by Jesus. And that's it.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a strange book, right? Because it's in 12 books. It's very orderly. Not a lot of action happens, right? I mean, it's a very short narrative, but it's got this weird kind of telescopic quality where things open out. So that middle section, so it's 12 books long, right? So the middle books 5 through 8, are Raphael basically talking to Adam, giving him the kind of backstory. Eve is basically serving dinner in the background, right? So this is really a conversation between the men about all the stuff they need to know. And so you might wonder, well, if Satan has showed up in book 4, why doesn't the fall just happen right then? You know, he gets warned away, and instead Raphael comes down and talks to them. It's really important that Adam, especially, knows the backstory, right? So that when they do fall, it's clearly their fault, right? You cannot say they weren't warned, that they didn't know, they didn't have a sense of what the stakes were, because they've had this long conversation for like 4 books worth.
Similarly, I guess it's important that they know when they're leaving exactly what's going to happen next, because the plot ends, the last few lines are them exiting Eden. But they've already had several books of description of what's going to happen in the future.
Well, they have. Adam has.
Oh,
right?
Adam has. Eve's not part of that.
Yeah, no, it's, well, Eve, she doesn't, she's so simple. Michael puts her to sleep, right? He makes her sleepy, so she takes a nap while the angel Michael and Adam go up to a mountaintop, and Michael shows Adam all the things that are going to happen, all the generations that will be born, and ultimately the redemption that will come through Christ. And when they get back, Eve wakes up for a nap, and she's all cheered up too, because God has sent her in a dream something that will make her feel less despairing. So each of them is kind of consoled and made not despairing, like they're sad that they're leaving, but they're not despairing, like they're not hopeless. But Adam learns to be not hopeless through the power of reason and revelation, where she learns to be not hopeless by just some like good feeling she gets in her dream. No comment.
More on that later, perhaps. One of the most familiar things to say about Paradise Lost is that the true hero of the tale is Satan.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. How do you feel about Satan? I mean, in the poem.
In the poem. Satan, the character in the poem. He comes off as the most reasonable person in the room.
For sure. And heroic and upset and tragic and understandable, relatable, right?
Yeah, he's #relatable.
He is.
Yeah, he's been wronged, or he feels he's been wronged.
Heaven is not fair.
Heaven is not fair, and he makes this case repeatedly in many different ways, and the arguments, at least on first glance, seem to hold up.
Well, yeah, he was not promoted, and he deserved a promotion, right? And he's really upset about this. And he does bring people together, and he does organize the hellish parliament of the opening books. And it's hard not to be sympathetic to him. He has some of the most memorable and persuasive lines, the mind is its own place, in those lines we started with. So it's kind of hard not to be on his side. There's this really famous phrase when Blake wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell in 1790, he says about Milton, he says, the reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. Which I always think, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a great thing to say. And you can understand why Blake would say it. Because the parts about Satan, you're like, yeah, you go. I mean, the revolutionary spirit is strong there.
So do you have some examples that we should look at?
Yeah, I mean, it happens throughout, especially the first couple of books, but also when Satan finds his way to Eden, there's also a couple of really powerful moments. One of them shows up really near the beginning of book 1, about 100 lines in, when Satan is getting himself together and trying to bring together the fallen angels to sort of think about what they might do together next. And he says, what though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield. And what is else not to be overcome? He's got a sense that he can bring them together. And yeah, he's talking about bad things, revenge, hate, right? But also courage, never to submit or yield. And a little bit later in that same passage, after he finishes his speech, it says, so spake the apostate angel, though in pain, vaunting aloud, but racked with deep despair. And I, even now, I know he's bad, but I'm like, yeah, that's terrible. I feel really bad for where he is. And we're invited to have these feelings over and over again.
What exactly do you suppose he means there by immortal hate?
Yeah, hate that will never die.
Right. Against God.
Yeah. And that's bad, right? Hate is bad. But at the same time, we get a strong sense that Satan believes he's been wronged. And later on, when we get the backstory, when Raphael is talking to Adam, how can I put it? On the one hand, we could say whatever God decides to do is right and just, because just by definition, whatever God decides to do is right and just. But it's also hard not to see the gap between what we would understand as fair play and what's just. It's hard not to see Satan as having a point.
Yeah. Satan lays out a case against God, but we even get to hear from God himself in book 3 about the rules that he set out for Satan and all the other rebel angels and really all of creation. Because he's making an argument about how he's imbued them with free will, the will to follow what he wants of them or to disobey and rebel and be damned. So he describes the angels, these rebel angels. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell. Not free, what proof could they have given, sincere, of true allegiance, constant faith or love? Where only what they needs must do appeared, not what they would. So in other words, if they're only going to do what they have to do, what they have no choice but to do, how can you know whether they're being truly allegiant?
It goes on in this super creepy way, too. Like, if they're just doing what they were obliged to do, what praise could they receive? What pleasure I from such obedience paid?
Exactly.
So God's pleasure comes in everybody's obedience. And on the one hand, you're like, okay. But again, this is a dark vision, kind of, and it's hard to understand how that's compatible with free will, right? I mean, you're free to obey, but if you don't obey, you'll have eternal torment. I mean, it's kind of a choice.
It is kind of. And you hit several moments where it feels like God's creation is set out so that people might fail. And are going to. Yeah.
Well, people talk about this actually with regard to Milton's theology. I don't want to get too far down the the rabbit hole or wormhole, right? Choose your metaphor of Milton's theology. But there is a way in which it's very hard not to see all this in terms of what's sometimes called the fortunate fall. In other words, yeah, obviously it's bad that the fall happens and, Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden. But on the other hand, unless that happens, you don't get the redemption that comes through Christ and the whole sacrifice and this whole drama, right, of redemption. And it's a very sort of paradoxical kind of doctrine, right? So to think it through, because on the one hand, you could say, well, the fall is fortunate because then you get all this wonderful stuff that happens, the redemption, the sacrifice and all that. But that means you have to think that original sin was good.
Right.
Which is theologically a really problematic position to take. But Milton invites us to think that through. Clearly he's inviting us to think it through.
Well, and also, God has set up this whole system. He's describing this system in this part. His son, Jesus, isn't going to come in and say, oh, no, I've got it. I've got an idea for how to solve this. I'll go down, become incarnate, and suffer with them to redeem them. Like that hasn't happened yet. That idea hasn't occurred
No,
yet.
but it's all worked out ahead of time. That's one of the reasons why this poem is so incredibly fascinating. Like, so at the beginning of book 3, the fall hasn't happened yet. The fall's not going to happen until book 9. I mean, Satan isn't even going to get to Eden until book 4. But all the way back in book 3, God is having this conversation with the good angels about what's going to happen. He's all pissed off at man already in book 3, even though the fall's not going to happen for 6 more books. He's like, whose fault? Whose but his own? Ingrate, he had of me all he could have. I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. So God is all mad way before this ever happens. And he's also worked out how it's all going to be sorted out. He hasn't volunteered the Son yet, right? He hasn't volunteered the sacrifice and redemption of Christ. That has to come from the Son. But he knows what's going to happen. He knows he'll say yes. He knows Adam and Eve will sin. He knows all this stuff. But Milton's laying it out for us. That doesn't mean that it's foreordained, right? And God is very clear about this. He says, they themselves decreed their own revolt, not I. If I foreknew, foreknowledge had no influence on their fault, which had no less proved certain unforeknown. And he's talking about both the fallen angels and Adam and Eve there. Like, I knew, but that doesn't mean it was any less their fault. It's like a box, you know? I mean, you're so trapped. It's hard not to feel this God is everybody trapped in a box that only has one way out.
Does it seem like later in Paradise Lost that there is a better version of this story that doesn't feel as much like you're being trapped in a box?
Well, that's the paradox, right? There are these moments where you definitely feel like you're trapped in a box, but then there are these moments that are clearly about mercy, about generosity, about making hard things easy. There's so many of those moments. Those come when Raphael is talking to Adam in books 5 through 8. It happens when Michael comes down and is consoling them. It comes, I think, most powerfully in the very last lines of the poem when Adam and Eve are being cast out of Eden, and the angel comes, Michael, and takes them both, one in each hand, and hastens toward the gate because the other angels bearing flaming swords are approaching, almost like mist covering the ground, right? So it's a dangerous scene, and it's almost like an adult with 2 children hand in hand, right? So Michael is sort of standing in that kind of almost parental role, helping them along their way. So there are these moments of tremendous like mercy and sweetness. But there's also this box. And Milton's theology has both those sides. And the poem makes that vivid for us.
I find it interesting, though, that it is the angel, that it's Michael guiding them parental-like rather than God.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that. I remember the very first time I read Paradise Lost, which is a really long time ago. Read it many times, right? Wondering about that and being very puzzled by that because there are some ways in which the way Michael behaves in those last couple of books, it's hard not to see him as a kind of Christ-like figure. He seems to be standing in a almost God-like role there. And it would be very heretical to understand Michael as a kind of manifestation of the angel who will become the Son with the incarnation. But Milton kind of invites you to think along those lines. And that would be very heretical. And if Milton actually thought that Michael was a kind of manifestation of the angel who would become the Son, who would become incarnate, like it's super heretical and super out there. But Milton clearly had absolutely no problem with developing his own theology and having a church of one. So while it would be an audacious thing to think, I absolutely would not put it past Milton to think that. So when you feel like, wow, it's weird that it's Michael there, that it's not God or the Son, well, maybe it is. We're definitely invited to wonder.
So when Satan finally gets to Eve and is trying to persuade her to eat this tree that she's been forbidden to eat, he uses some interestingly similar rhetoric around that. So he's pointed out the fruit, and she says, oh, that's the one fruit I can't have. And he says, indeed, hath God then said that of the fruit of all these garden trees ye shall not eat? Yet lords declared of all in earth or air.
Well, he's really entrapped her, right? Because she's kind of explaining what it's like there. And she says, you wasted your time bringing me here to this tree. She's like, of this tree we may not taste nor touch. God so commanded, and left that command sole daughter of his voice. The rest we live law to ourselves. Our reason is our law. And Satan's kind of got her trapped here, right? He's like, oh, did God say of the fruit of all these garden trees ye shall not eat? Yet lords declared of all in earth or air. I mean, how can you be lords of this place and have a prohibition? How can that make sense? And she's kind of not equipped to deal with this argument, right?
But also we wonder, is that a valid argument? I mean, why is this tree here then? Why has this tree been placed here with a big do not eat sign?
Yeah.
It's the quintessential.
It's a marshmallow experiment.
Yeah. It's a quintessential problem of the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden story. Why have they been set up for this failure? And again, we've already talked about this a bit.
Yeah, this is what God's talking about in book 3. Like, if I don't set it up so they can do wrong, what good is their obedience to me? What value does their obedience have unless they can fail? Which makes sense, but it's dark.
Yeah. And it's going to put them through some terrible miseries. And that invites us to once again question whether this whole system is in fact rigged against humanity.
Yeah. No, I think we're meant to wonder about that. The way that Satan is heroic and reasonable, the way that God seems to have made this kind of box that it's impossible to find your way out of. So you have to ask, what is the poem expecting us to think? We've said already one of the things that the poem does that is really demanding and tough on us is to make it hard for us to see the justice and what God chooses to do. And at the same time, we're constantly being reminded of what a difficult situation Satan is put in. We said already that he's heroic and he's a leader, but he's also often sad. Like, we already noted a passage earlier where he's like almost despairing. And there are quite a number of these passages that happen where we see Satan being boxed in almost in the same kind of way that Adam and Eve are boxed in a little later on. One of those happens in book 3 when he's on his way to Eden. The fallen angels are trying to figure out who's going to go check out the new creation in Eden. And nobody wants to volunteer because they're all afraid. But Satan, because he's brave, he volunteers. He puts himself forward and he heads out on this voyage. And he goes through the cosmos. He encounters sin and death. We might talk about them later. And he gets to this kind of crossroads where off to one side he sees this stairway, and to the other side, opposite it, he sees a path down to this world. So he's sort of, for a moment, between these two choices, almost these two directions that he might go in. And it's a very beautiful passage. I'm just going to read a couple lines. The stairs were such as whereon Jacob saw angels ascending and descending, bands of guardians bright, when he from Esau fled to Padam Aram in the field of Luz, dreaming by night under an open sky, and waking cried, "This is the gate of heaven." Each stair mysteriously was meant, nor stood there always, but drawn up to heaven sometimes viewless, and underneath a bright sea flowed of jasper or of liquid pearl. So it's this alluring sight, right? And you almost wonder for a moment, well, Satan could go back, these stairs that lead to heaven. Is that path still there for him? Is that door shut? He takes the path down, right, where he's going to be the tempter and he's going to seal his own fate. And I always feel like that's like this moment, this suspended moment where you wonder, could it have been different? Ultimately, theologically, clearly it couldn't, right? God has closed the door to him, right, in some profound sense. And I think we're meant to feel that poignancy and that wistfulness. Another moment like that comes when Satan gets to paradise and he sees Adam and Eve talking together and being really happy with one another. And he says to himself, sight hateful, sight tormenting, to see those two in bliss, and me, I'm suffering. In some ways you're like, oh, self-indulgent, right? But on the other hand, you're like, yeah, that must be incredibly painful.
Yeah. He's already made a firm decision, it seems, to stay in hell. Yes, as we said in the beginning, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. He's made this argument many times.
But he's wistful. He sees this other possibility. On the one hand, you're like, oh, yeah, it's bad. He's jealous. He wants that for himself. On the other hand, you're like, wow, he must feel terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, we're meant to feel that.
Yeah. That Jacob's Ladder passage, of course, is a reference to a passage in Genesis in the Bible.
Well, it's kind of neat, right? Because obviously this whole work is referring to the Bible, right? It's giving us an account of creation, right? Of the early days in Eden, of the experiences of Adam and Eve and so on in the fall. But it's also got this reference to a totally different moment that happens much later in Genesis, in chapter 28, when Jacob is on his way from one place to another, also in an experience of exile. And he has a dream, this strange dream, where he sees a ladder let down from heaven and angels climbing up and down. And that is a kind of a turning point in him becoming the chosen one through whom God's chosen people, right, will come into being. And you got to wonder, why is that moment there? In a part, it's there as a kind of torment of Satan, right? A reminder of the path to heaven that he can no longer take. But it also is doing something for us. It's making us go, well, why are we thinking about Jacob? Why are we thinking about the children of Israel? Why are we thinking about God's blessing on that seed and that future? Right. So on the one hand, this is that crossroads that's going to mark Satan's ultimate damnation. It's going to mark the fall of Adam and Eve, but it's also going to lead to the chosen people and the redemption. right? And so that's what that ladder is doing there. It's doing a whole bunch of different things. So these intertextual moments for Milton are like wormholes, right? They're like taking us to other books, but they're also taking us to other possible futures and other points of connection.
Yeah, and the text is absolutely littered
Full.
with these. There's a phenomenal pileup of them in a section describing sin,
Which is so cool.
which is to say, sin, the daughter of Satan, towards the end of book 2.
Yeah, it's a creepy, creepy passage, isn't it?
Why don't you read us a section of it?
So Satan is on his way from the place where all the fallen angels have been gathered to go to Eden. And on his way there, he encounters this figure and he doesn't recognize who she is. And she's puzzled because she's like, how can you not know who I am? And then she explains, she says, have you forgotten me? She says, you used to think I was so beautiful way back when in heaven. And she tells her backstory. She says, all of a sudden, she says, miserable pain surprised thee, dimmed thine eyes, and dizzy swum in darkness, while thy head flames thick and fast threw forth, till on the left side opening wide, likest to thee in shape and countenance bright, then shining heavenly fair, a goddess armed, out of thy head I sprung.
Which is the Athena story. It's how Athena was birthed, bursting out of the head of Zeus.
Exactly. And so Sin is the daughter of Satan back when they were in heaven, at that time as beautiful as he was, right, when he was being Lucifer. And so she's his daughter, but she's also, as she describes, his desirable consort, right? She says, familiar grown, she says, I pleased and with attractive graces won the most averse, thee chiefly, who full oft thyself in me, thy perfect image viewing, becamest enamored. So in other words, her father, Satan, looking at her, seeing how much she looked like him, fell in love with her and impregnated her. She says, my womb conceived a growing burden. And then, so pregnant by thee, she says, and now excessive grown, prodigious motion felt and rueful throes. And then she gives birth, right, to death. And death is born from her. And she says, I fled and cried out, death. Hell trembled at the hideous name and sighed from all her caves, and back resounded, death. And so it's like an echo, right? So we're getting another kind of intertextual reference here now.
Yeah, so we've had several in a row here.
Yeah,
We've
it's so weird.
References to Narcissus, we've had references to Myrrha, we've had references to Echo, all of these coming from Ovid's Metamorphoses.
You have to ask, what is he doing with that?
Yeah, what is he doing with that? I mean, part of what he's doing is placing this story in the context of other epics.
Mm-hmm.
But part of this also seems to be throwing in illusions that are much harder to account for. Athena, goddess of wisdom, like the patron god of Athens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
How is sin like that?
Mm-hmm.
Are any of those echoes, so to speak? Is that how we're supposed to be thinking of sin?
Well, I think it's there's a lot to tease apart here. I think one of the things that's going on is when sin bursts out of Satan's head, like Athena bursting out from the head of Zeus, it's meant to make us think about how gods produce their offspring. And therefore, we're invited to think about the Father and the Son, right? Like God the Father and the Son, right? And we've been talking about that already. So we're not going to get a direct comparison of Satan and his daughter Sin to God the Father and the Son, right? That are going to have that conversation at the beginning of book 3. But through the figure of Zeus, we're kind of invited to think about that. Like, to what extent is Satan godlike? To what extent does he also have this regenerative capacity? To what extent is he himself, like I said, almost godlike, or at least aspirationally almost godlike, clearly in a very bad way and in a very perverted way, right? So the Narcissus and Echo story here, we've talked about that when we were reading Ovid, is really about this sort of desire turned back upon itself. And the Myrrha story too, explicitly in the context of incest, it was about desire turned back upon itself, leading to all kinds of improper naming. And that turning back on itself of desire is something that shows up even more in this account of sin and death, right? So sin is the daughter of Satan, like who bursts forth from his head, and then she gives birth to death. But then death comes to desire her, impregnates her in turn, right? So her son now has impregnated her, and like monsters come out of her. It's incredibly disgusting, this passage. So he chases her, inflamed with lust. Me overtook his mother, all dismayed, and in embraces forcible and foul, engendering with me, of that rape begot these yelling monsters that with ceaseless cries surround me, as thou sawest, hourly conceived and hourly born, with sorrow infinite to me. For when they list into the womb that bred them, they return, and howl and gnaw my bowels, their repast, then bursting forth again.
Yeah, that's a very visceral image.
Well, it's hideous, right? And also this idea that this cycle of birth and impregnation has now become, I don't know what to call it, like chronic or incredibly fast. Like they're hourly born and hourly go back in and they gnaw her and they're born again. It's like this self-reflexivity multiplied 1,000 times. It's really creepy and disgusting. So even while we're encouraged to see Satan as kind of admirable or pitiable, or we're moved by him, or when he goes to Eden and he feels really sad looking at Adam and Eve, that is all happening. But we're also being reminded, look at what's born of that. Look at the hideousness that comes out of that. So we're not off the hook either. If we feel bad for Satan or we're kind of drawn to be of his party a little bit, we're also reminded that this does not end well.
Another intertextual moment that really struck me this time around comes in book 4 when we're being told about Eve's creation. So this is Eve telling of her first moments alive, what she remembers the first day she remembers anything.
Yeah, isn't that neat?
Which is an interesting situation to be in.
Yeah, I keep thinking of Hal at the end of 2001 or something. It's like it's this strange moment of, if you could give an account of your first moments of consciousness, right? What would that look like?
So what she does is she wanders about for a bit, lies down on the side of a lake, and as she describes it, as I bent down to look just opposite, a shape within the watery gleam appeared, bending to look on me. It started back. But pleased I soon returned. Pleased it returned, as soon with answering looks of sympathy and love. And it goes on. But we have immediately here an echo of Narcissus.
Yeah.
But strangely, or delightfully even, when I was reading this, I forgot what book I was reading.
Oh, is
and
that great?
had a moment of like, oh, I'm reading the Narcissus story from Ovid. I'm in the middle of Ovid. I completely lost track of where I was and was just in that other text for a moment.
That's so great. Well, he invites it, right? Because it's so close, and then it does something different, right? In the following lines just after what you were reading.
And even the way that it's structured, the text is structured with these kinds of echoes that, as we talked about in our Ovid episode about the way the scene unfolds, where echo gets to respond. So I started back, it started back. Pleased I soon returned, pleased it returned. It's using the same language.
Absolutely.
So yeah, even on that level, it was drawing me back in and making me think I was reading Ovid.
Isn't that cool?
It was amazing. I've never had such a trompe-l'oeil effect in reading a text.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating to think about that because I think it gives you really insight into what is peculiar to Milton. I don't think anybody else does that. He's reminding you of the Narcissus episode because of the content. Like he wants you to think about that story and the ways in which it's understood and self-reflexivity and the nature of desire, all that stuff we just talked about with regard to sin and death. And also he wants you to inhabit that fully intertextual environment where, like you said, you forget for a second which work you're in. And why would you want to do that? Like, what is the purpose in doing that? Because there's that jarring effect, right? Those lines you just read, what thou seest, what there thou seest, fair creature, is thyself. With thee it came and goes. But follow me, and I will bring thee somewhere else. That but follow me almost is like the thing that wakes you up almost as if you were waking up out of a dream, right? Where you're in that Ovidian story. And now you're in this other place where instead of sitting there and looking at yourself, Eve, you got to go look at this other thing. But she's not too excited about that, is she?
No. And I think in some ways this is a very swift way of painting out the character that Milton gives Eve, where much like Narcissus, she is beautiful and very simple. And that's how she engages in the world, and that's how she needs to be treated by Adam.
Yeah, she is limited.
Which I think might lead us to start talking about how sex and gender is portrayed in here. Because we have Adam and Eve. We have the two archetypes of what's understood masculine, feminine, male and female. And they have two very different roles.
Yeah, it's such an interesting poem, right? I mean, even while I'm revolted by the gender politics, I'm fascinated by the way in which he handles it. There are two people, but they're also, we're reminded over and over again in sometimes very extraordinary ways, almost one person, right? Following the biblical account, Eve is formed from part of Adam's body, right? From the rib, right? To be at his side, right? Milton folds all that out for us. But that also means that she's subsequent to him, right? He comes first, she comes second in terms of time. And that priority and that secondary nature informs everything they are. So I don't think Milton would understand himself as sexist or anything like that. He would understand himself as following the order of creation.
Right.
But this idea of them being two people and also one person, we get that sense over and over again. And Adam even gives explicit voice to that when the fall happens in book 9. He says as much.
No, he brings it up a fair amount. He brings up the fact that ideally, in true love sense, they would be of one mind, which would be his. He also brings up quite a lot that she is made from him.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore
He is a part of her.
He's a part of her, but also has this paternal, maternal role towards her. Like, you came out of my flesh.
Yeah.
And therefore you are to be respectful and subservient to me.
Yeah, there's a sense in which she is born from him in the way that sin is born from Satan, right?
Right.
In some sense, right? That's kind of creepy, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, like there are these moments where it's very moving. You know, remember when we read the Symposium, we were talking about the different accounts of love that we found there, and Aristophanes gives that account, that beautiful myth of human beings having been creatures that had male and female natures, and then they were pulled apart, and then they always spend eternity looking for their counterparts, right? And so that sense that you might have when you're in love, that as if the person, your beloved, is a second self, is completes you in some way, and you're only part of a person as long as they're away from you. That's kind of here too, like when they leave Eden and they go together hand in hand on their solitary way, right? They're solitary in the sense they're apart from other people, but solitary also in the sense that they're soul, they're together, right? And then there's many passages that give us that sense of them, but it's also profoundly hierarchical and profoundly troublesome.
I was thinking as we were talking about the birth of sin and her then, so to speak, devolution into just becoming a vessel for more births and more terrible things to be birthed out of her, that this is this is obviously a very strong connection between birthing and sin, which obviously is going to be leading straight back to Eve.
That's right.
And straight back to this gender politics that's going on in this poem. And
yeah, I mean, it's kind of horrifying, right? Part of their sentence in being expelled from Eden is that she's going to bring forth children in pain, right? But that's the thing that comforts her, right? When Adam comes back from his meeting with Michael and has seen all this revelation up on the mountaintop, and Eve says that she too has been comforted in her dreams. She's learned that the Redeemer who will come is going to be born from her, right? So she's embracing this vision of bodily maternity as her redemption, right? And again, it's very, I guess so. Theologically, it makes sense, but it is a really impoverished kind of participation in some ways. It's hard for it not to feel like a kind of impoverishment.
There are two other moments that I can think of, at least, where Eve's agency leads to downfall. First off, Adam and Eve are having an argument about whether or not they should split up for the day. Work separately, do similar things, but, I'll do a work over here in this part of the garden, you work over there.
And he's like, we shouldn't do this.
Yeah, there's temptation. And she's like, no, I think it'll be good. And of course,
and she's like, don't you trust me?
Yeah. And of course, that's when she runs into Satan.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So that doesn't end well. And then similarly, after they know they're going to be expelled and after they know what's in store for them or part of what's in store for them, perhaps before they know about the entire redemption arc, Eve has a plan for how they're going to solve this problem of this terrible life that they had ahead of themselves. She's going to suggest that they commit suicide.
It's really interesting what happened. So they've had the fall. They're both absolutely heartbroken, blaming one another initially. It's this terrible fallout. And Eve is full of despair. She's a mess, right? And so she's sort of falling down before Adam. She just doesn't know what to do. She wants to take the blame on herself. She is so sorry for what she's done. And she says, look, it's just unbearable, this thought of bringing children into this world. So they're going to suffer in the same way we did. We can't possibly do that. That would be a cruelty to them to bring them into this world. And if that's unbearable to you, she says to Adam, to stay apart in that way, maybe we have another choice. So this is what she says. How miserable it is to be to others cause of misery, our own begotten, and of our loins to bring into this cursed world a woeful race. She says, childless thou art, childless remain. So death shall be deceived his glut, and with us too be forced to satisfy his ravenous maw. But she says, if you think it's too hard to sort of hold back and not have these children, instead she says, let's just do this. She says, let us seek death, or he not found, supply with our own hands his office on ourselves. Why stand we longer shivering under fears that show no end but death, and have the power of many ways to die, the shortest choosing, destruction with destruction to destroy? And she stops, right? She can't even talk anymore. She's so upset. And Adam has learned. You remember that whole thing about where she's like, oh, I'll go work in this part of the garden, and you work over here, it'll be fine. And he said, okay, fine. And now he's not going to listen to her anymore. He's learned. And so Adam is, with such counsel, nothing swayed. And he replies and says, no, I have a better idea. Let's just go say we're really sorry. Which turns out better in the end.
I guess.
Yeah, but it's an interesting moment, right? Because she's full of despair and it's moving. She's so upset, and you're like, you read that and you're like, yeah. It's a lot like Satan, right? And Satan is full of despair, and you read that and you're like, yeah, you can totally understand being in that place. But Adam has learned, right? Adam is more of God's party at this point, right? He sees that while her heartfelt contrition is a good thing, and he wants to praise that, he's not going to follow her lead. He's not going to obey her ever again.
Right.
Which is good, I guess.
I think, yeah, I think you reader, draw your own conclusions.
Well, this is the thing, right? This is, I mean, that's one of the things that's so incredibly troublesome about this work that we both find so troublesome, right? It's a well-defined and contained system. It makes sense within the system. And as long as you're inside it, you understand where you are and what you should do and what is right and what is wrong, right? You could figure that all out. But it's just repellent. And the poetry is beautiful. What do you do with that?
Yeah, the poetry is beautiful. So, where does Milton stand in all this? The last text we looked at, the Inferno, famously Dante is in it. He is the main character. He's the one doing the tour through hell, through purgatory, through paradise. Milton doesn't self-insert as directly here.
Yeah, he kind of shows up in a weird, oblique kind of way in the openings of the different books where he'll invoke the muse. He's like, this is going to be really hard to tell this poem. It's going to be really hard to do this. Like, so the poet's voice is there in some sense, but it's always kind of outside. It's like in the frame. So that's the extent to which he'll let himself be there as an actual voice. But if you think about where does he stand in terms of what does he think is right? Where does he feel? How does he feel? How does he invite us to feel? This is an interesting question. You remember when we were talking about Dante last time? We talked about how as Dante gets farther into hell, he starts being mean to the souls in torment, right? Early on, he's real sympathetic. Like when he sees Paolo and Francesca, he feels really bad for them. And he faints because he feels so bad. And then later on, by the time he gets into the bowels of hell, on the way down, he'll kick one of the sinners in the head. And once he gets to the bottom, he'll actually lie to one of them and say he's going to wipe away their frozen tears and doesn't do it. And Virgil's like, good job, right? Dante's almost become like one of the tormenting devils in hell himself. So Milton is very different, but similar in the sense that there's this almost educational kind of process that we as readers are meant to undergo here. We're meant to come around to think, yeah, God is right. Yeah, Adam did this to himself. Satan did this to himself. Like we can kind of see what's required of us theologically. So that's kind of happening there. But Milton himself is very evasive. I think there's this one moment where you can see something like the stand that Milton is really comfortable with at the very end of book 5, when we hear about one of the angels who was with Satan and the band of angels that would become fallen angels, but doesn't stay with them. He doesn't rebel in the end. And this is the angel Abdiel. I may read a couple lines of it.
Sure.
So they have a kind of a back and forth, and Abdiel ultimately decides that he is not going to go along with Satan and the others. He says, I see how this is going to end. He says, soon expect to feel his thunder on thy head, devouring fire. Then who created thee, lamenting learn, when who can uncreate thee, thou shalt know. So that's his last words. And here's the end of book 5. So spake the seraph Abdiel, faithful found, among the faithless, faithful only he, among innumerable false unmoved, unshaken, unseduced, unterrified. His loyalty he kept, his love, his zeal, nor number nor example with him wrought to swerve from truth or change his constant mind, though single. And it's such an interesting moment, right? What it means to stand and to not do the thing. That's what Adam doesn't do, right? He doesn't stand. And that's what Satan doesn't do, right? Abdiel stands and doesn't fold. Even if he's all by himself, he's right. And that strikes me as such a Miltonic point of view.
Right.
A party of one.
So if Milton is a party of one, or is doomed to being a party of one, is this his attempt to get you, the reader, over to his side? Is this an attempt for him to find friends?
It's an interesting question. You know, the opening of the poem kind of lays out what the purpose of the poem is, and it tells you what it's about. If you're in doubt as to whether mankind should have stood or fallen, you know, whether there was coercion or whether it was a false choice, you know, the opening line of the poem is of mankind's first disobedience, right? So it kind of lays out for you in the very first line whose fault it is, right? So, and that opening passage also includes a line that kind of tells you what the poem's for. He ends that opening passage saying the poem is for these various purposes and to justify the ways of God to man. Now, you might ask, why would the ways of God need to be justified to man? What justification does mankind deserve, right? It's enough to know that you're supposed to obey, right? But when you think about the poem as a whole, it's really about that. It's about explaining to you the backstory, why you should do what you should do. It doesn't make you any less obliged to do the right thing. But if you do the wrong thing, you cannot say you didn't know. It's a trap, right? It's to make it so that if you don't obey, you can't claim it wasn't your fault. It's to make it your fault, right? So that seems to me like he's someone, strikes me as a poet with a mission, right? To make you know that if you felt you had no choice, maybe you didn't, right? But I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, it's a poem that's an incredibly beautiful piece of poetry, but it's all yoked in the service of this really powerful theological commitment, which is kind of revolting, right? But I find Milton really hard. I find Milton really hard to get away from, because it's a disturbing, totalizing vision. It's a very discouraging vision, I think, of the divine. But it's beautiful poetry, and it's hard not to be sucked back into it every time you read it.
So when you read this text, do you find yourself wanting to be swayed the way that Milton wants you to be swayed, wanting to find this a justification?
I find myself feeling that Milton is right and being very resentful of it. And then being like, no. It's like wrestling. We were talking before about that wonderful passage of the Jacob's ladder, the ladder that's let down that we see in Genesis 28, where the angels are coming up and down. And then what happens to Jacob is he wrestles with the angel. And that for him is this pivotal turning moment what leads to him becoming the sort of father of the chosen people. And this wrestling with angels, I mean, that's what that poem feels like. I feel like, where you're in a tussle of some kind when you're reading it. And it's not one you can win, but you can fight. Kind of. That's what I feel like with that poem.
And much like any good angel, very beautiful.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm finding myself coming back to the theme that we had decided would underlie this group of three that we'd read, Dante, Milton, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, evil. What is evil in this poem? Where is evil in this poem? And on the one hand, I guess it's in Satan and his offspring, sin and death and the horrible little things that emerge from her and gnaw her insides, right? That's evil. Satan's choices are evil. Mankind's choices are kind of evil, right? In the sense that they go away from God. God is right and just, but it's hard not to see it as cruel too. So our very sense of what is evil, what is bad, I think is really troubled in Milton in a way that Dante had already troubled it a little bit, right? When Satan wasn't this horrible, looming, evil presence, but this babbling idiot frozen in a lake.
I feel like so much of what I've read of Paradise Lost, evil is defined simply as disobedience to God, whether that is justifiable or not. It's just that is what evil is. And we get some of these passages like the description of sin that we talked about earlier, where it does start to feel a bit more like what we might recognize as something evil or something bad or something disgusting that we wouldn't want to be a part of. But it doesn't feel as thorough an investigation of evil as the Inferno did. It doesn't show you all these examples and tell you all these stories of people who've been evil in various ways to make you feel revolting and then try to thread them together with some underlying theory of evil. That's not really what this seems to be about.
No, there's not that kind of systemization of evil that we saw in Dante's Inferno. There is this one kind of curious echo where you remember after the fall takes place and Satan is really happy for a minute because he's like, yeah, we managed to corrupt creation. Good job. And he goes back to report to the fallen angels what all's happened. And this strange thing happens. Satan gets back to the fallen angels and he's expecting them to all shout and applaud and be really happy. But that's not what happens. Expecting their universal shout and high applause to fill his ear, when contrary he hears on all sides from innumerable tongues a dismal universal hiss, the sound of public scorn. And a little later, he would have spoke, but hiss for hiss returned with forked tongue to forked tongue, for now we're all transformed alike to serpents, all as accessories to his bold riot. Dreadful was the din of hissing through the hall, thick swarming now with complicated monsters' head and tail. So this idea of this kind of nature of your sin being written on your body, right? He was disguised as the serpent. Now they are all serpents, and they're only able to hiss, irrationally to each other. There's this kind of sense of a correspondence between the sin and the punishment. And then also, remember that disappointingly ineffectual Satan that we saw at the bottom of Dante's Inferno? Evil here looks also very ineffectual. It's like a bunch of hissing snakes, right? It's not a well-focused, powerful kind of evil. It's a dispersed, impotent kind of evil.
But the thing that I thought of when reading this passage was how it seemed like, and again, I haven't read the text closely enough, so maybe I'm misunderstanding things here, but it seemed like hell was meant to be a place where Satan or these demons could be sovereign, where he could rule in hell. That was part of the agreement. He's being cast out, but he'll have this place.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, he doesn't really have this place. Or maybe he's transgressed by leaving and going to earth. But nevertheless, this is a space in which he and all of his associates can be punished from outside. And wait, when did that rule come in?
Well, that's the paradox of exile, right? Exile is a kind of freedom in the sense that you're outside of that place of control, but you're also imprisoned in some sense. You're cast out. Right? So it's that kind of double nature of exile. We talked about exile a little bit too. We were reading Dante, right? We were talking about his experience of exile and how the bitterness of that experience kind of underlies his poetry. Milton doesn't end up as an exile in the sense that he's not exiled from his country, right? But he does end up a kind of political exile when the government changes. And this is, just before Paradise Lost is written. He's no longer on the inside of the political organization, right? He's actually really at risk in that period of being executed along with other revolutionaries. And one of his friends, Andrew Marvell, the poet, intercedes for him and kind of keeps him, they're like, oh, he's blind. He's not really able to do anything. No reason to punish him, right? So this double nature of exile, right? You're cast out, but you're free. That seems to be something that is really resonant with Milton's own experience. And I think it's one of the reasons why Satan's exile is so poignant. It feels so real.
Well, unfortunately, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
And there's so much we didn't get to talk about, like angel sex. I hope we get to talk about that in the future.
We forgot to talk about the angel sex.
Well, maybe next time.
Maybe next time. But in fact, next time we're going to be looking at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Which is also it's about evil, but it's also about monstrosity and creation and things being born from other things. So a lot of the issues we talked about here with Milton, I think, are going to come back.
So Frankenstein is one of those texts that was heavily revised during the course of the author's life. We'll be looking at the original version of it, the 1818 version. But if you read the later version, that'll be fine too.
It's fine.
It's fine. It's fine.
One of the things that'll be really interesting, I think, in talking about Mary Shelley next time is, again, we have a woman writer that we'll be talking about. And especially because I think Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is really interested in thinking back to other accounts of creation, like what we find in Milton's Paradise Lost. It'll be neat to think about the ways in which the gender politics we've seen here are reflected or kind of countered in what we see in Mary Shelley. I think that's going to be really, really something.
Excellent. Well, if any listeners want to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at @thespouter. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/8. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.